Welcome to the AWIP podcast. I'm your host, Rae Smith. Here we focus on investigations and all things animal welfare related. We're bringing you in depth conversations each week with animal welfare professionals around the globe, so be sure to find us on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Spotify. To learn more about AWIP and our mission, check us out at awip.org.uk or at awipusa.org. I keep reminding everybody that it is an election year. I'm sure everybody's well aware of that, but it's really critically important. And I know that talking about politics and stuff can be kind of scary, but just bear with me. We have a great guest on today that's going to help walk us through some of these things. I promise it's not going to be scary. We're going to talk about all different kinds of laws, specifically in Texas, but kind of from all over. And it's going to be really great. It's going to be really important to bear in mind that, the election is not everything having to do with the president. And I know that's the main topic. But a lot of the things I think that I've been telling people recently is that your other legislators and these bills and such are really what's going to have a more profound daily impact on our lives each day and the animals that we serve. So, to help walk us through all of this stuff, we have the executive director for the Texas Humane Legislation Network, Shelby Bobosky. Hey, Shelby, how are you doing? Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much, Rae. And I just am enjoying this so much. For everybody, we just learned that we grew up probably less than 10 minutes from each other.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And so hearing your voice is like, I don't know, a slice of warm apple pie. It brings me back. Being in Texas all these years, I love a Chicago accent. So
Well, that's probably the nicest compliment I've had in the past month. So,
love it.
one of my fellow Midwesterns.
That's
So,
right.
this is crazy.
Fighting the good fight for
If you guys are
the
gonna get
animals.
distracted with our twang out our
Yeah.
with our accents, so it'll be
Just a little
interesting.
nasally, just a little.
A little bit.
Love it.
So yeah, we're getting political. Yeah. It's scary. We're gonna get through it. It'll be okay. It's not gonna be that bad, I promise. So, Shelby, before we jump into this, can you give us a rundown on your experience in animal welfare and how you became the executive director?
Sure. So, and before I begin with that, I love the intro of trying to draw people in softly.
Yeah.
How, I know politics right now scares people, truly. Like, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to deal with that.
Mhm.
But I urge people, I'm not as soft as you. I'm saying you should get political for animals,
Mhm.
especially if you are, let's say, running a C3 and you are, or a full time volunteer at a shelter, whether you're a shelter manager, whether you're an ACO, all of these professions, our legislators don't hear enough from us,
Mhm.
right? And herein lies the problem with respect to funding, with respect to the realities of animal welfare and sheltering right now,
Mhm.
and really making this just as important as education and some of the other top issues that are out there. So I urge people to get political for animals, and I'm not as kind and soft as you are, but yes. So I have been involved with Texas Humane Legislation Network since around 2009. I heard about it because I was an attorney practicing law at the time, and I could not believe that there weren't certain laws, for example, in Texas, surrounding large scale breeding facilities. Like, I couldn't believe that it had to get to a cruelty situation before any kind of inspection was happening at a place, for example, that had 500 dogs, in a suspected
Mhm.
puppy mill. So
Yeah.
that's when I thought, well, how is this legal? And then I realized through one law, you can effectuate change for thousands of animals. And so, really, I was hooked, and I've served in multiple roles on the volunteer side. And then I became the executive director in 2019. And I love my job. It's incredibly challenging, intellectually challenging, and because there's a lot of issues right now with animal welfare. But it truly is the number one way to effectuate change. So that's why I'm all in.
And the organization is not exactly new. It's been around for a while.
Yes, it has been around. We will celebrate our 50th anniversary next year. And it's really interesting because as I've worked in this organization and grown with it over the last 10 years, I've seen that so many other states have their own C4 organizations. So if you're not from Texas, that's okay. Texas loves you anyways, as Lyle Lovett likes to say. But look for your own THLN in your own state. They are, I mean, I do monthly calls with Missouri, New Mexico, Georgia,
Mhm.
Mississippi. I mean, New York, Connecticut, so many states. I think there's 23 states that I at least know of, and I know there's more that have their own statewide C4 organizations. So, what the Texas Humane Legislation Network does is we are here to promote the humane treatment of animals through legislation and advocacy. We are a C4, which is different than a C3 because we are allowed to lobby. Unfortunately, our taxes are not tax deductible. But what we found with a lot of individuals and even sometimes other C3s and organizations is, you know, they want to effectuate change and they're not too concerned about that tax write off. So, we were built by volunteers. I stand on the shoulders of all the leaders at THLM before me, but really we passed the first. I mean, when you think about this, it's nuts, right? But the first shelter laws and shelter
Mhm.
guidelines back in the early 80s and beyond, all the animal cruelty laws kind of went through our organization and have been strengthened throughout the years. Dogfighting, cockfighting, puppy mills, all of that. And then, as most recently, is fixing the state licensed breeder program because we know we can't shut down puppy mills. The best next thing is to regulate them and try to stop the cruelty before it begins. So this is a long-standing history that I'm very proud to be a part of.
Well, it's really interesting to me because I think that there's a lot of people out there within the shelter world who, as you'd mentioned, aren't aware of another, network like that you have that does this lobbying on their behalf. And I think it can be probably really difficult because if you are, a government-run facility and you have this nonprofit C3 status, a lot of times, like you're just barred from taking a stance on whatever the topic is. And I think it's pretty difficult because of course those c3s want to be able to properly educate people, and kind of lay out the foundation of what is going to make these animal protection laws better in their respective states. But they essentially have this gag order on them where they're not allowed to do that. So it's really, to me, very enlightening to learn about all of these things from you and what you do for Texas. That there are options out there and ways to like work through you guys to help pass some of these laws that really these organizations want to, but have a very difficult time being able to be outspoken about it, which is really odd to me because if you are, the experts in your field on sheltering, animal protection laws, and this and that, you should be able to do that. So it makes it so difficult.
Hmm. I'm so glad you brought this up, Ray, because I'm here hopefully to dispel some myths surrounding that. Number one, I am an attorney, but I'm not anybody on this podcast attorney. And so I want to make sure that everyone understands I'm not giving legal advice, but I can tell you general rules surrounding what you can and can't do as a C3.
Yeah.
So C3s can lobby. They actually can, but they can only lobby up to 50% of their net proceeds or profit of that year. And so they have to be careful, but at the same time, when would you ever get that close? For example, sharing your C4's post, right? Or going out individually. Okay, maybe, for example, the organization Humane Tomorrow doesn't want to put a post out there, or they've already put 5 posts out there. But that doesn't mean that all of their board of directors and that the individuals can't lobby themselves individually. They always can do that. And so I know that there's been kind of this scary, like, oh, you're a C3, you can't lobby. That's not true. There are definitely parameters around that. I would always tell you to check with your attorney on the board first, but you definitely 100% can lobby, because from our standpoint, we get our strength from our stakeholders. So for example, when we passed a ordinance in Dallas that said no more puppies in pet stores, trying to stop that puppy mill pipeline to Dallas, we had 122 rescues with their logos in support of our
That's
ordinance. And
awesome.
it really helped the city council members understand, oh, wow, here's a groundswell of support. And so they can definitely use their voice. They just have to do it in accordance with the law, and there are some parameters. If you work for a government shelter, this is really, really important. I'll give a quick example. In Texas, a couple of sessions ago, there was actually a bill brought that said if you had empty kennels at your shelter, you actually could be charged with a misdemeanor. It was the government, excuse me, the animal shelter manager, and then the next in charge. And THLN really rallied a lot of our shelter partners to say, are you okay with this? And there was this backlog of like, no, we can't participate. You most certainly can participate. You at least need to tell your lobbying team, if your city has a lobbying team. You also can use your individual voice, call up your state legislator, explain to them that yes, you might have empty kennels, but you should not be penalized for that. It could be a totally other reason. And even if it was that reason, right? So at the end of the day, you definitely need to be using your voice if you're in this field, and you just need to learn how you can do that. Another mention is that government employees also have associations that work for them. So if you are a shelter veterinarian, you can go through, for example, your local veterinary medical association. If you are a shelter manager, you can go through your association of counties. Or if you are a police officer in a sheltering situation, you can go through your local law enforcement association as well. So you can use your voice in other ways to at least let them know about bills that you don't like, but also bills that would definitely help you in your job.
Well, I think that's super important because there's some things that I had learned just having been in this profession before. I think it's just been so perpetuated by upper management at various agencies around the country is like we can't be political, we can't have a stance on this, and we're there to serve the public and we have to be not biased, and it just every time someone comes in, it just perpetuates you can't say this or that. And so
Yeah.
I think that's probably why it's so prevalent. So it's really interesting to hear you dispelling those myths and helping people like understand that you as an expert really should be the ones who are the loudest and giving the best information to members of the public, policymakers, city council, all of these important people who are going to be actually making these laws. Like it just doesn't make sense, right? When you look at like other professions, if you have the AVMA, for example, or like just human doctors. They're not taking information from like the general public who knows nothing about surgeries and such, and putting them as standards. You should be listening to your actual surgeons and doctors who are in the field, who are experts on that, to be able to
Yeah.
give the best advice. What's the well, for people who don't know, like the empty kennel law, why was that even a part of legislation? Like, why in Texas? Like,
Yeah.
what was the
Um,
benefit of that?
So, on that particular issue, there was a national organization that came into Texas and was very upset with this one particular shelter. And they felt that they weren't doing enough life saving. And so the whole point was, well, if we ensure that the kennels are full, then we know that these shelter dogs and cats won't be euthanized. But again, if you don't speak out against what I perceived as incredibly bad policy, then who is?
Mm-hmm.
But also, to go back to your point, everything is political now. You can't really avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
Everything. And so, whether it is your US state senator or your local city council elections, they need to hear from you, or you're not going to be included in the discussion. You know what's a good example of this is this idea that animal control officers should be first responders.
Mm-hmm.
If you are an ACO and you're new to the field, or you've been doing this for 20 years, I ask everyone to join their statewide animal control association, because the more numbers you have, the bigger voice you can have at the Capitol. But I learned something too, Rae, because I had no idea the extent of what ACOs did. That truly is already first responder status, but they're not getting the accolades as such. For
Mm-hmm.
example, there's a hurricane. Um, the employees have to stay throughout that. That's first responder. There is somebody that passed away at a house and there's 4 dogs protecting the body. Guess who goes in to get the dogs? Not the police, the actual ACOs. There is an injured dog on the side of the highway. Who's pulling over to pick up that dog? So my point is, I learned throughout this that ACOs are already acting as first responders in the state of Texas. Let's try to make them as such. And so I've really urged those individuals to reach out again in their individual capacity to their local legislators, but also through their organizations. Again, I don't want someone to come back and say, Shelby, I got fired because I started using my voice. Like, no, no, no. You always have to check with your supervisor. Always, always, always. And who knows, your shelter manager already might have had those conversations with their lobbying team or their manager, who then went to the local association. So again, they need to hear from you. Otherwise, how else will they know what is happening in the animal welfare world?
Mm-hmm. Well, and like to the topic of like first responders, I immediately when you're talking about this scenario pops up in my head is um, when police are calling you out, and like this is an actual real life example. I won't tell you what agency it's from, but police are calling code 10 emergency, lights and sirens, we need you here right now, because somebody was attacked by a dog horrifically. Call notes saying that it was a police officer, they were bitten in the face, you can hear screaming on the radio, and to have to come back and say, I can't run code 10, I can't be there for you, I can't, I'm stopping at all the stoplights, and this is because I don't have the ability to. It's
Right.
like it's almost insulting to not only APOs, but to just the idea of being a first responder in general, because it doesn't help you as an agency. It doesn't help fire, police, CMS, all of that. And like to like further to that, like there I know of some agencies who the um, cities or counties will be very nitpicky. They'll say you're not a first responder, but if you're off for the holiday and we have an emergency, you need to come in, and
Yep.
because that's your job. And so it's like fitting that you're a first responder when it fits them, and not to acknowledge that for APOs. And I just like think, because there's still this perpetuation that APOs are dog catchers and that's all we do, run around catching dogs. And I would tell you, like firsthand experience, that's probably on the lower side of what APOs actually do on a daily basis, is running around catching dogs. They're more focused on these criminal investigations, things they're writing warrants for, doing a great job of, writing notes and all of these really difficult tasks that is exactly the same thing that police officers and detectives are doing, only APOs are doing it for animals. And you're put in that difficult situation where you're not just dealing with an animal or a couple animals, but a person or several people as well. It's extremely, I know, I would argue to a T that it is more dangerous, in my opinion, a lot of times to be an APO than it is to be an armed police officer responding to these same type of calls, domestic violence things, often by yourself and without backup and without even another APO with you.
100%. And we are seeing more examples like that. For example, 2 years ago, a city south of Dallas, there was a guy there, and he had some dangerous dog calls, and they were going out to see him. And the animal control officer was smart and asked for backup with police. They went. The ACO was shot in the stomach, and a police officer was killed. And this was all on an animal call. You know,
Mhm.
1 in 3 police officers in the state of Texas are going to animal related calls, whether they are serving warrants and there's an animal in the house, whatever kind of papers they're serving, they are seeing animals 1 every 3 call. But yet, animal control officers are called to the scene. And in that actual tweet from the governor sending his condolences, the governor of Texas, he never even mentioned the ACO. And so that is why the ACOs need to use their voice and say, we need to be considered first responders. But in addition to that, something else you brought up, and this is really from a 40,000 foot view, how are we going to elevate the status of an animal control officer, animal protection officer, as you're calling them? Our sheltering professionals, if we're not seen as first responders, and it all is tied to funding, right?
Mhm.
And so if you're seen as a first responder, that automatically helps not only the vision of what an APO looks like and what they should be, but also to properly fund these positions. You know, our biggest problem in Texas is we are not funding our shelters as they should be. Talk
Mhm.
to any city council member. For example, have your city council members or any of your elected officials been to your government facility? you know and I'll tell
Mhm.
you, a lot of them haven't. I am the chairman of our local shelter in Dallas, and I urged all the commissioners to bring their own city council members to the shelter. And it was great because I called my city rep and I said, hey, you've been to the shelter, right? Mm-mm. So we did a tour. She brought her staff. It was amazing because
Yeah.
then they get to see how difficult your jobs are on a daily basis. So again, it's just getting more elected officials involved in what you do on a day-to-day basis, whether it's a tour. What about asking them to do a ride along with an
Mhm.
animal control officer? What about naming your longest shelter dog who just can't seem to get adopted after the mayor, and getting the mayor down there and trying to do a campaign about getting that dog adopted? I mean, there's just so many ways that you can get your elected officials involved in what you do, and then they can truly see the value of your job and how important it is.
I love that point. I don't think that agencies do that nearly enough. I don't, and everything comes down to funding, right? Everything comes down to support. You could, I think a lot of times shelter executives will voice, what is going on in the shelter, and they'll kind of talk about it. But it's different to say something than it is to see something yourself. And so I think that's very much to your point. And I wondered, Shelby, what you thought about um, since APOs and police work so closely together on a variety of different calls. I mean, the police in general is relatively well supported by the public, I think. I know there people will have differing opinions on that. But in general, as a public safety agency, they're tend to be arguably more well funded than some other areas within a city or county. And so I'm wondering like what your thoughts are on, since APOs work with law enforcement so often, to be able to form those relationships and develop them over time with those who are higher up in the chain of command in PDs, to have them also help have that voice and advocating for why APOs need to be first responders, why the shelter needs to be funded, because I mean, it really does affect them too. Police officers
Absolutely.
bringing in animals to the shelter, like I would argue that they probably are more aware a little bit about the conditions that APOs go through and what the shelter looks like and such
Yeah.
than your city council, than your state representatives.
Absolutely. And I will tell you this, through our through the Texas Humane Network, we go and travel the state with animal law attorneys and some seasoned 30-year sheltering veterans. And so we do training on animal cruelty and then the basic, laws. We have an amazing Texas civil seizure law where we can remove animals and such. And it's very interesting because when we go, we include ACOs and they get hours through the state agency, right, for their CEs. But we also invite law enforcement agencies. And so the first question we ask when we get everyone in a room is, do any of you guys know each other? And a lot of times they don't. And what we're learning is they're so siloed, and it doesn't have to be that way. When you look at how vast and how big Texas is, being from the Chicagoland area, I moved down here in 99. I could not believe that Texas has 254 counties. We're huge. But a
Mhm.
majority of the rural areas truly are their animal control is run by the sheriffs.
Mhm.
And so we know that we are going to get support for the ACOs as first responders because the ACOs are already working for the sheriffs in that capacity. Now they're considered ACOs, but guess what? If you go to a city, that they are not first responders. And let
Mhm.
me tell you, if the police actually came against such a bill, which I don't think they would, I mean, I wouldn't want to be that police officer that's waiting for an ACO to come get a dog when I've learned that they came against a bill to make them have that first responder status. And
Mhm.
in addition to that, at least in the state of Texas, tow truck drivers are first responders, but ACOs aren't, right?
Yeah.
Um, 311 operators are first responders. So let's get real about this definition and again, elevate that status. And I also think by elevating that, let's train our ACOs. Let's get them the training that they need. And so I think this kind of all comes together nicely in building up our animal control professionals because they deserve it. Their jobs are incredibly difficult.
Well, and it means a lot that you recognize that and promote that and talk about that all the time in supporting APOs. I mean, it's so nice to have somebody with so much experience who really understands, the work that APOs do. Um, and, I guess coming back to our original discussion about um, getting political for animals. I know it's all tied together, but let's say like your shelter executive or your shelter staff, whatever your role is, and you have these upcoming bills, like just like I've been reminding everybody, it's an election year, and there's a ton of bills. I know where I am that are about all different kinds of things. Whether to ban slaughterhouses and pit bull BSL bans and things like that. If you have not ever worked in legislation before and you don't really understand how the legislative process works or how grassroots advocacy works, what can you kind of walk us through then, Shelby? Like, what is the process of, like, this is the kind of law that we want to improve or create or edit or revise or whatever, and to be able to improve it for whatever the reason is? What does the legislative process look like?
That's an excellent question. And so the first thing I would tell anybody is to see if they have a THLN in their state, right? If they have a C4 organization that is working on legislation, get with them. Are you a stakeholder in the conversation? Are you part of the conversation? And let's say they do, but they're not focusing on something that you want to change. Okay. What are the next steps? Always bring your bill ideas to not only your C4 state organization, but then also your higher ups. Again, always go through the chain of command, always, always, always. But let's say, for example, in Texas, we are working on some bills behind the scenes and one of them is looking at the current cockfighting law. And so we know that there have been some counties and cities out there that have had these massive busts, and they're realizing voids in the current law or problems that they say, if I could just have this one fix, then I know that we could prosecute more of these cases.
Mhm.
And so what they did, whether it was a sheriff or whether it was a district attorney in a very urban area, they went up their chains of command, and then they went to the current legislators and said, hey, I've got this issue. And so if you're an ACO and you see something, always go up the chain of command. That is what everybody in Texas is doing in attempting to make animal control officers first responders. If you are a shelter manager, if you have a legislative team, which you usually do in more urban areas, if you go to them first. Now in Texas, I can tell you it's a bit late because a lot of the city councils and counties met this summer. But for example, what we were trying to do is get no more puppies in pet stores on the city's legislative agenda, because a lot of cities have their own legislative agenda and they want to pass their own laws, whether it's we're running out of clean water, whether it's, we need to do something in a particular field. And so in many cities, we, along with other groups, were actually able to get animal welfare issues on their agendas. So that means when they go to the legislative session next year, their own state representatives and senators will say, oh, this was on 5 cities to pass. I'm going to support it because
Mhm.
those are my constituents. So it really depends in every state. But my first word of advice is go to the local C4 in your state and see what they're trying to pass. And if you have your own ideas, you definitely need to go to the people that you report to. And then those higher ups can go to their legislative team, because sometimes these are the best kept secrets that are like, once you talk about them, you're like, that is such an easy fix. For example, we went ahead in Texas and we banned gas chamber euthanasia in 2013 for shelter dogs and cats. Okay. But unfortunately, the code still requires um, the trainers to train on gas chamber euthanasia, when in fact, as far as we're concerned, there are no more gas chambers left in Texas. They were around for a certain part for wildlife, but they've all been gone.
Mhm.
So a lot of people avoid that part of the code and don't teach it. Why would they? But sometimes it's something as an easy fix like that. Like, let's go to the state legislature and fix this so that we as trainers aren't, going against our own law, because it
Mhm.
doesn't make sense to train. Does that, that's a good example.
I mean, I can imagine that coming to legislators and city council can be difficult because we have all of these problems and, they're dealing with all of these human issues. You mentioned clean water and there's a whole myriad of things. I can imagine that it would probably be difficult at some points in time to get people to actually listen and care about and vote and support
Mhm.
animal protection bills. So, is that been your experience at all? How do you approach something like that, or how would you recommend that those within the shelter world, if they want to pass something like this, if they run into that roadblock, what should they do? How should they approach that?
These are all human issues. They really are. And you can always connect them to humans. For example, if you have a rash, and this can be a local example, if you have a rash of dangerous dog bites in certain zip codes and you really need to work on the ordinance, but you have some city council members that don't want to look at it, bring them data. Bring them, sometimes your best thing is, this is out of my what do you call it, paycheck, right? Go talk to your city council member about it if you want it. We'd love to change the law,
Mhm.
but we can't. But the city council members can. So that's a good example. If you can always bring it back to a human aspect, for example, especially on the gas chamber euthanasia, we had some shelters in Texas. This is 2013, 11 years ago. A lot of things have changed. But we had certain county officials and cities that said, I'm not going to change. We're going to continue the gas chamber until we're told to by law. So what we did is we went in and, oh my gosh, Rae, there were 4 counties that were using gas chambers that were homemade.
I
I'm
mean, you're
not
killing me a little bit on the inside. It's,
It's and so what would happen is when they would turn it on, they would have to leave the building. And so we went to their senator and their state representative and said, I mean, we know it's odorless and tasteless. This could kill them.
Mhm.
And yet you're allowing, and they were, after they heard that, they were immediately on board. So again, it's not always about the animals. There is always a human element. When, we helped pass a bill that basically says pets need to be in protective orders. Well, when you go out and get all of the domestic violence groups on your side and you show them the data and the statistics that victims stay because they don't want their animals abused, they will definitely get on board with that. So,
Mhm.
when you have this human animal link, it always helps. And that is truly for the people that will tell you, I don't care about animals. And that happens a lot. I
Mhm.
get that. So, anyways, you can always link it to other areas. And I think the gas chamber bill was a really good example of that.
I think there a lot of people are doing a really good job of educating, I mean, people in general, not just, legislators and stuff, about the human animal bond and why that affects people and what the benefits are of understanding all of these things and how they're so interrelated. Honestly, I feel like election years, in my opinion, are the best because that's when they're trying to, satiate the public. Obviously, they want to get reelected. It's like, but you need to actually listen to the things that are going on. And if this is what you expect and this is what you want our support for, then you need to actually care about these things. You need to actually care what's going on with the animals in the shelter in and out. You need to actually care about the staff who work at the shelters who all have an incredibly difficult job. I mean, I would say even you too, because you're always pushing and legislating for the betterment for animals in their conditions, but also like your shelter staff too, who are there in charge taking care of them.
They are the only profession that is tasked with caring for animals that they may have to euthanize.
Hmm.
It's impossible to even try to comprehend that. And so we try to help shelters and the employees there as much as we can because they have very, very difficult jobs. But you bring up a really good point, which leads to I want to interrupt you. I'm like, yes, 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 and I want to keep talking about this. But we have 29 days to elections. And so, what is the first step if someone's watching this? I want to get political for animals. I volunteer 40 hours a week and I walk dogs at a shelter. I never thought, man, should I look at bills that are out there? Because I have a unique perspective of the overpopulation that's happening, right? At least in our state. But please, the first thing you should do right now is see who is up for an election that you can vote for. In the state of Texas, we have federal legislators that are up for election. We also have state, and then in a lot of areas, you have city council members. And like for example, our C4, we have the voting records of since 2009 on state senators and state representatives. And you can go see if you have a candidate up, have they been endorsed by an animal welfare group? What is their voting history? We tend not to do scorecards because Texas is such a unique state, but a lot
Hmm.
of states have scorecards. I can tell you that Humane Society's Legislative Fund has a fantastic scorecard federally.
I was
Um,
just going to mention that.
I'm always going to push for like statewide,
Hmm.
um, always looking to the state first because it's incredibly difficult to pass a federal bill, especially now with an election coming up. So many things are standstill. When
Hmm.
in Texas, we meet every 2 years at the legislature, and a lot of good bills pass and some not so good bills pass. So you can always see their records, but go find out what happened. If I can give a quick story on the Safe Outdoor Dogs
Hmm.
Act, this
Yeah.
was the bill that really fixed our statewide tethering law. It took us 3 sessions to pass. The first 2 sessions, we had a state representative that killed the bill at midnight, the last moment we could pass it. He did procedural tactics the first and second time. Do you know why we passed it in 2023? He wasn't there. He wasn't there. And so people don't realize that you can vote someone out of office if your voice is big enough. And that had actually become a nationwide issue, because the second time he did it, get this, Rae, within 4 days of this legislator using a procedural tactic to kill our bill, they had in his own district, so these are voters that could vote for him, not someone in California or New York. They had assembled 122 people within the district to do a walk from the local dog park to his office. And I don't know. I don't know enough about it to say, but maybe the writing was on the wall that, imagine how hard his reelection would have been with
Mhm.
really upset people with chained dogs throughout Texas suffering in 110-degree heat. So, anyways, it's just a cautionary tale and a good example that, we have a voice and we can use it collectively. And I mean, when that bill passed, it was unbelievable.
I mean, that's absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's like disturbing that somebody would want to kill a bill like that so badly. I have no idea what his arguments for against that were in the first place. But it kind of reminds me of a similar story that I had. So, in Aurora, Colorado, um, there the breed specific legislation, or BSL, was actually repealed. So they were allowed to have pit bulls, and then some guy came and messed the whole thing up. It's a whole long story, but so the BSL was reinstated, and it was very, very difficult. I know, for the shelter there, and just the city in general, residents, people who had ended up being going from dog pit bulls being legal where you could get them, and then it was that way for I don't know, 3 years, I think. And then this bill gets, tossed back out, saying that it didn't go through a proper legislative procedure, and now pit bulls are banned again. And everybody was freaking out. The shelter was freaking out because, of course, the shelter, the majority of the dogs there are pit bulls. So it's like, what are we gonna do? But I was so upset about this too, right? Because I live here. I'm like, I don't want this to. I don't have pit bulls, but the BSL. There's so many arguments for against it, and I don't think we have the time to go over it here. But the point that I'm making is that it was so frustrating to me, and I was so against it that I just was compelled to write a letter to our city council, to the mayor. I included them all in it, and giving them and telling them, this is what I do for a living. This is how long I've done it. These are all of the statistics and examples from different legislation around the entire country as to why BSL doesn't work from a financial standpoint, an economic standpoint, a human animal bond related standpoint. And I am not going to go as far as to say that that letter is what did it, but I will say that there were other people who had formed like coalitions behind that on the BSL, and having all of these other people speak out along with me and sending letters and demanding these things get put on the ballot for the election year this year felt really incredibly powerful. It felt, and we're going to vote on it next month. But even just having the satisfaction of being like, I made a change. I did something that's going to affect me, my neighbors, all of the peoples that are here. It feels fantastic to do those things. And I was very much in this position, as I'm sure a lot of people are. That's like, I hate politics. I don't want to deal with them. But
Yeah.
it's true, like that small these small elections, the things that are going on locally within your city or your county, maybe your state. These are the things that impact you the most. These are the things that are going to have real world, everyday impact and affect your life, your family's life, your friend's life, your pet's life every single day. These are the elections that count. These are the issues that are most important. And so, through that personal experience, I have come to that point where, like, I approach it. I know it's very difficult. I was there, I was in that position before, but this is why it's so important. And look at the changes that you can make by having a voice, whether you're a member of the public, whether you work for a shelter, whether you're a state representative or a local representative or a mayor. It's all about voicing your opinion, and get out there and vote.
Get out there and vote. So many things to say. Number one, just shout out to Texas. We have a statewide ban against BSL. So on occasion, some, current or local people will say, hey, in this town in Plainfield, they passed a BSL ordinance. No, no, no. Here's the state
Mhm.
law, says you can't. But also use your voice. I cannot, so let's talk about the next thing, which is great. Once you find out, let's say your state representative has a tough election and they have 100%, they have voted in favor of every animal welfare bill that has been brought, maybe with one or two exceptions. How can you help them get elected? You can have a yard sign. You can go do, you can be a greeter at a poll. And let me tell you, when you do this at the granular level that a state representative or a city council member is, and you know them, then when the legislation starts, they will remember that you got them elected and you help them. And then they're going to listen to your concerns. They might bring a bill idea you have. There's so many ways to help. And that's how I originally got started too, is I ended up block walking and really believing in my state representative, who then ended up being the mayor of Dallas. So you just never know what will happen. But, when you're looking at these issues, you hit really something that's important: local issues. So we had a situation in Dallas recently where we had uh, there's one company that has a horse-drawn carriage company. And as you know, in Dallas in the summer, it gets so hot. And actually, the downtown area is considered a heat desert, where because of the buildings, the unique makeup, it's 10 degrees hotter. And so I have to say that I went to a local meeting with my own city council member who was the lead against what I wanted. I went in,
Mhm.
it was very hard for me emotionally, and I've been doing this for 10 years. But I got up and I said, I ended with, and I see that the Dallas police are here, and thank you for not using your mounted horses in such heat, because even you have regulations that don't allow the horses out in such weather. And when I walked away, it was like, la, like I don't, you just have such an intrinsic feeling of good that you spoke up for whatever the issue is that you're feeling at that time. And so, and what you're saying. So in order to actually make positive change, you need to vote in those animal friendly candidates. But then that's when the work starts. So let's say the legislation starts, okay? What you said is so accurate. It is a 2-minute phone call. Please, I would urge people, in my opinion, petitions don't work. Although change.org and some of these other petitions out there, in my opinion, they're great to bring an idea to someone, and wow, this has 100,000 signatures. But Texas legislators do not care about someone that lives in Australia. They just don't. And, a lot of the staffers will print those petitions or emails and just put them to the side. A 2-minute phone call is to your legislator is easier than ordering pizza. I'm not kidding. You call them up, and if you follow organizations like THLN or your state or even your national groups that file bills and you believe in it, you call up and say, hi, my name's so and so, this is where I live, because they want to check and see that you're a constituent. That means that you live in the district and that you may or may not have voted for them. I really support House Bill 2417. You want to know why? I volunteer at the shelter every day. And, it's so important that you see the importance of animal control officers being first responders. Or, I was at the shelter the other day when a 12-week-old puppy was dropped off. It was bought at a puppy store and it had parvo and they didn't want to pay the vet bills. Whatever you're saying to them, they need to hear those stories. And that 2-minute call is, you're using your voice, but in an effective way. Let's be effective. If you want to meet with your state representative or state senator, we can help you do that. However you want to extend that. But you gave such a good example. I am a subject matter expert on BSL. I'm going to let them know all the problems this caused. And then they ended up using your letter. But let's be proactive beforehand. Let's try to get to, where it doesn't come to these issues. Perfect example, really quickly, is in Texas. We passed some bills basically giving anyone the right to farm. Well, now a lot of the urban areas are seeing huge problems with this. Do you think, Rae, that you should have to shelter chickens and goats because some supposed, person that wanted to be an urban farmer had no idea what they were doing? So maybe, if we can get to some of these problems, like you said, because once a law becomes a law, it is a law.
Mm-hmm.
So during the legislative session, if there is a bad bill out there, please use your voice and, try to help the legislators understand why it's not a good idea. In Texas, we have 8,000 bills filed and you have 6 months to pass a bill. So, do you think a 22-year-old staffer that might be an intern has any idea about the animal bills? No, not if
Mm-hmm.
they're not getting traction. So, sometimes you can be a subject matter expert. You call them on one bill and they call you 2 weeks later and say, "Oh, God, another animal bill was filed. What do you know about this one?" And then they're educating you, and then you can in turn educate them. I do have a question for you, though.
Okay.
You know who your state representative and state senator are? Do you know who currently represents you?
Oh, Shelby, you're making me look bad here.
I do not mean, no, you're right. You are everybody that I talk to, really. And
I
it's
wanna
actually,
I wanna
go
tell you yes. I wanna tell you yes. I'm gonna tell you no, but I could probably think about it.
okay.
But if
Well,
I didn't, I would know how to find out.
good. And that's another point I'd love to make. Right now, those candidates want your vote. They want your vote. Go to their Facebook page, go to a town hall meeting. They are all out and about. They're greeting people. If you have a shelter, invite them to your next event. They love seeing people, like if you have a spay neuter clinic or a vaccine clinic next Saturday, just call, email or call the staff working the campaign and saying, "Hey, would you like to swing by? We'd love to tell you about, the overpopulation crisis that's hitting X, Y, and Z," whatever the case is. There are town halls, there are ways to see them. One of the best things at a town hall is at the end, they allow you some time. If this is a legislator that has an excellent, voting history, and you go and thank them for helping the animals in your area, and people start clapping, there's nothing better than seeing a surprised elected official in a good way. Because usually they're getting calls, they're getting yelled at, they're getting complaints left and right.
Yeah.
But if that legislator helped with the Safe Outdoor Dogs Act, or let's say helped strengthen the animal cruelty law because they know the link between interpersonal violence and animal cruelty, let the other voters know that.
Mhm.
Anyways, just some, and I did not mean to put you on the spot. Listen, I didn't know my state representative either when I started. And my favorite is when I say to people, "Do you know who your state senator is?" They're like, "Ted Cruz." Like, no, that's your federal legislator,
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
sometimes it's so confusing to go to who to which on what issue. But state laws really, they're meeting much more than our federal legislators. And that's really where like 90% of the laws come into play, at least for the state of Texas. So when you get to know those officials, it's amazing. And then also, especially for your city council members, whatever local issues you're having. Bonds, people don't even understand that their shelter might be 20 years old.
Mhm.
Do you want to go get a new shelter? Is your shelter old and has holes in it where you can see the outside?
Mhm.
Go to those local bond meetings and stick up for, the shelter managers, the ACOs and the animals that they care for. So it can go to the federal level and it can go down to your itty bitty state issues and your city issues.
It's about forming those relationships and getting them to remember you and having those personal interactions with these state legislators, your local legislators. It brings significant impact. Like you said, because all they're doing is getting yelled at or getting like some random, generic email from people wanting things to be passed. But having that personal relationship, I mean, really does have an impact. And
And I
so,
really saw that, Ray, with the opposition,
yeah.
right? I don't
Hmm.
think a lot of people know that the American Kennel Club oppose laws to help animal control officers, shelters, and our C3s. Like,
Hmm.
I just don't think they realize that.
Yeah.
So anyways, it's a good point. I didn't mean to cut you off, but knowing
No.
your opposition as well. The Safe Outdoor Dogs Act, it was fascinating to see the national opposition that came out of the woodwork, and the ADBA. I mean, oh my gosh, they were flooding our legislators. We had a actual state senator ask me, so I don't want to ban any of the dog sledding because you need chains to help with the dog sledding. I said, sir, let me get this straight. Do you think that we have dog sledding in Texas? And then he was like, oh my God, excellent point. But do you see what I'm saying? Like, you know,
Hmm.
there was so much outside opposition. And then you might be the only voice of reason to help them
Hmm.
understand, like, no, dog sledding does not happen in Texas, right? So anyway, that was an actual argument. I just want you to know. So
Well, I mean, it's a hilarious one.
it is.
Shelby, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate, I mean, I genuinely, I mean this, all of the work that you do for APOs, shelters, shelter workers, animals, particularly in Texas, but really you do it everywhere. And you give this advice and you connect with people from other states all around the country, about a variety of these issues, how to help them and things like that. So I just want to say thank you for coming on. Thank you for all the work that you do. Thanks for talking about this topic. So many different aspects that went into this very, very critically important topic, especially with what is going on this year. So I just really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Ray. And there's so much work to be done. And, if I can just leave with some parting words for any individuals that care about animals, any C3s that have never been to their own shelters. Oh, it's too hard. I can't go down there. You know, there's this saying that I'm going to totally screw up right now, but to walk a mile in someone's moccasins is so important. We should be asking our animal control officers, animal protection officers, what do you all need? How can we help you? Because a lot of us can't do your job. And so if I can just impart that to any person that might have seen a crappy Facebook post or gotten something in their mind that just maybe wasn't accurate, about what happened that day at the shelter, I urge all of you to go down and see how can we help. And that starts the dialogue, and people aren't so siloed, and then we're all working together to help the animals. So thank you for having me on. This was fun. Love it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great ending quote. So I'm not going to say anything further other than thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in. I hope that this helped, and thank you for supporting AWIP, and we'll see you next week.